So, I first met this evening's guest 4 years ago at an Ida Hobbit event on the old Steam. Ida Hobbit being, of course, the International Day against homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. And I remember, of course, that you spoke passionately about equality, fairness and accountability, and I was impressed. Not just with what you said, but that you made the effort to come out on a really cold and wet and wintry evening. On the website, Caroline writes, "I may not be your typical MP. I may not fit in with the grey suits of Westminster, but I know that being there matters." And you're right, because good stewardship is about the willingness to step up, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly in the world. I believe that you do exactly that, and I'm very grateful for it. So I'm immensely proud this evening to welcome to the Village MCC Joint Leader for the Green Party, Member of Parliament representing Brighton Pavilion, the Right Honourable Caroline Lucas.
Well, thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm really grateful and really honoured to be here with you this evening, and thank you so much, Reverend Michael, for asking me to come and share some thoughts tonight on the issue of stewardship. And I guess I was just trying to think, stewardship, what does that mean? And for me, it's a combination of that individual responsibility, collective responsibility, and I suppose in some way, some kind of moral responsibility, for want of a better word, that crosses borders and I think applies to everyone, because we are all custodians of our planet, our home, irrespective of our backgrounds, our beliefs. Just this week, many of you might have seen that red sky over Brighton on Monday. And the Argus reported this phenomenon as being like Armageddon. Thankfully, not the first time they were wrong on that. But the red skies on Monday, I think, just do serve as a reminder that land borders are irrelevant when it comes to consequences that we feel here from events that happen many miles away. So those red skies were a consequence of the dust from the Sahara, the impact of Hurricane Ophelia, debris from forest fires in Iberia, and all of those came together at that time and manifested themselves as this kind of redness in our skies on Monday. And to me, I suppose that was just a little kind of analogy about how everything is connected, and that what we do here, the decisions we make in our daily lives, whether that's about what kind of food that we're buying or how we're heating our homes if we do, and so forth, all of those do have consequences. So I'm going to talk a bit about stewardship, and I'm going to do it through the lens, if that's all right with you, of climate change. And I know it's a bit predictable, but I have to say, for me, the climate crisis is the thing that keeps me awake at night. It is the thing that is, to me, the greatest threat that we face, and I spend an awful lot of time thinking, what more do we need to do to mobilise to try to avoid the worst of climate change? How are we best to be stewards of this planet, our one and only very precious home, which is at risk like never before? And we know that time is running out, and we know that there's plenty of evidence of the accelerating climate crisis all around us. And I guess for me the question is, given that we have all of these facts and figures, we're not short of that evidence, why is it, in the face of all of that evidence, we don't actually take the actions that are needed? And I don't just mean us, but I mean governments and the international level as well. And I'm reminded of a film, I don't know if you would have seen it, it was out about 10 years ago. It was called The Age of Stupid. It was about climate change, and it featured the wonderful actor Pete Postlethwaite. And he plays a sole survivor of some kind of climate catastrophe. It's based in around the year 2050, and this sole survivor looks back through real newsreels. So he's looking at weather reports and newsreels of real weather events that have happened in the early years of this century. And he's looking at all of this stuff about the hurricanes and the typhoons and the heat waves and the freezing temperatures. And he says, in words that still make the hairs go up on the back of my neck when I say them, he says, why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when there was still time? And I think that question, quite honestly, is one of the most important ones to try to address today, and it does quite literally haunt me. Why is it that we seem to be content to go down in history as the species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction rather than taking some active steps to do our best to avoid it? And I want to make the case that I think that it's partly because we're not making an emotional connection. You know, we've got all of these reams of facts and figures, and if you want to go and look at it, you can see things about carbon intensity, parts per million of this. You can see stuff about all kinds of technical, you know, calculations of how soon different kinds of thresholds of warming will be exceeded. There's all of this scientific data there. But somehow it doesn't touch our hearts, I would argue. And sometimes I think to really contemplate what the climate crisis might bring us is almost too difficult. It's almost like we just don't want to go there because it's just too awful, that sense that climate change might become irreversible, that societies, even in the developed world, might no longer have the ability to respond or to cope. And sometimes I think it just feels like the magnitude of the crisis is so huge and the challenges of tackling it so enormous, it just feels overwhelming. And so, you know, the only rational response can sometimes be to just go down the pub and forget all about it, because otherwise it just seems too big. But as I say, our failure to act can't be because we lack the evidence. We know, for example, that last year was the hottest year on record. The previous record was set in 2015, the one before that in 2014. No fewer than 15 of the 16 warmest years ever on record occurred in this century. So, in other words, since 2000. Arctic sea ice covered a smaller area in the winter 2015 than in any winter since records began. And India has been hammered by cycles of droughts and floods, and southern and eastern Africa have been pitched into humanitarian emergencies by drought. Wildfires have been crossing America, coral reefs around the world are bleaching and dying. And just a few months ago in Canada, due to intense glacial melting, the course of an entire river shifted. The Slims River, once full of life and energy, just simply vanished. So we don't lack evidence of what's going on. So why is it that there isn't the urgency around action that one might expect? Well, I think there are lots of reasons. There's the power and the vested interests of the fossil fuel companies who, not content with simply lobbying government not to move quickly to address this issue, they're actually being given senior roles inside Whitehall. I asked some questions to find out how many secondees from fossil fuel companies like BP and Shell are actually inside the civil service advising, in inverted commas, our ministers. And there's large numbers of them. So that's obviously stopping the kind of action that we need to see, because the fossil fuel companies don't want their profits to be undermined. And another reason is, of course, that people are just trying to get by. These are difficult times with austerity, with housing benefit cuts, with welfare being undermined. You know, it's hard enough for many people just to get food on the table and to know that they've got a safe roof over their head, that to try and start a conversation about the future of the planet just feels like, you know, this is just not where a lot of people are at, and I understand that. And another reason perhaps is, you know, that we're just bombarded by advertisements, hundreds if not thousands of them every week and every month, all of them just trying to persuade us not to ask the big questions about life, just to go out there and keep consuming. You know, because we're not beautiful enough, we're not clever enough, we're not smart enough unless we go and consume whatever the latest gadget is or the latest thing that's going to make us even more beautiful. There's a wonderful phrase about that from Professor Tim Jackson, who talks about the advertising industry, and he says that, you know, basically there are all of these people who are trying to persuade us to spend money we don't have, to buy things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't even care about. Not a definition of wise action. So lack of progress on climate change is caused by a mixture of what I've described, the vested interests, the fact that people are just too busy trying to get on. But as I say, I think it's also caused by that fact that very rarely do we ever just sit with the reflection about what climate change might really mean, because it's a kind of scary thing to do. And I'm struck by the phrase that we won't protect what we don't love. The American author Richard Louv puts it like this. He says, "We cannot protect something we do not love, we cannot love what we do not know, and we cannot know what we do not see and touch and hear." And that's why I think all of us getting access to the natural world, and particularly for children, to be able to be out in the natural world and to see and to touch and to know the world around us matters so much, and why our schools, I hope, can make more time so that kids can be out in nature and really learn how beautiful nature is and learn to love nature, because it feels to me that it is through that sense of love for our surroundings that we might just galvanise the necessary action to protect this planet of ours and to be the stewards that I think we need to be. One of my favourite authors is Zadie Smith, and I hope you don't mind if I give quite a long quote from an article she wrote. But she writes about this whole issue of how love spurs us to action when it comes to the environment. She writes about it so beautifully. And so I hope you don't mind if I quote her. She says, "There is scientific and ideological language for what is happening to the weather, but there are hardly any intimate words. Is that surprising? People in mourning tend to use euphemism. Likewise, the guilty and ashamed. And the most melancholy of all the euphemisms, the new normal. It's the new normal, I think, as a beloved pear tree, half drowned, loses its grip on the earth and falls over. The train line to Cornwall washes away, the new normal. We can't even say the word abnormal to each other out loud because it reminds us of what came before. Better to forget what was once normal, the way season followed season with a temperate charm only the poets appreciated. We always knew we could do a great deal of damage to this planet, but even the most hubristic among us had not imagined we would ever be able to fundamentally change its rhythms and character, just as a child who has screamed all day at her father still does not expect to see him lie down on the kitchen floor and weep. Oh, what have we done? It's a biblical question, and we do not seem to pull ourselves out of its familiar, essentially religious cycle of shame and denial and self-flagellation. And that is why the apocalyptic scenarios did not help. The terrible truth is that we have a profound historical attraction to apocalypse. And in the end, the only thing that could create the necessary traction in our minds was the intimate loss of the things we loved, like when the seasons changed in our beloved little island. I just think that's so beautiful and so wise, because it does seem to me that planting love for our environment, and whether that is a special tree or whether it's a special place you like to be when the sun is shining, or whether it's going down to the seafront, or whether it's counting pebbles on the beach, whatever it is that love of place that I think can be where we can get the strength from to be able to be stewards of the planet. And through that love, I think we can plant hope. And hope is a rather wonderful thing. Hope not just simply as in wishful thinking, not hope as in having your fingers crossed behind your back, and hope just like, sitting on your sofa with a lottery ticket. Not that sort of hope. But a more kind of radical hope, hope that changes things. Because you love something enough to connect with it and to imagine a different and better future. And having imagined it, having that compelling vision of how things could be, that helps you to work towards it. And I hope you'll forgive one more last quotation from another favourite author and activist. Her name is Rebecca Solnit, and she wrote a wonderful book that I warmly recommend called Hope in the Dark. And from that short book, this is a quote about hope. She says, "Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out of the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed, Hope calls for action, and action is impossible without hope. And so, armed with hope, perhaps we too can move through what Zadie Smith calls the elegiac "what have we done" to the much more practical "what can we do." And so I want to end by a bit of a call to action today. Remember what you love and do anything you can to fight and to protect it, fight for it and protect it. And I want to say there are reasons to be hopeful. I know I've been a bit bleak so far, all of the kind of visions of what climate change might have in store of us, but let's not forget that as well. Yes, last year was the hottest year on record, but it was also the year that Portugal, for example, ran entirely off renewable energy for 4 consecutive days. It was the year that the number of solar-powered homes in California topped 6 million. It was the year that volunteers in India planted 50 million trees in 24 hours. It was the year where, at Standing Rock, Native American climate change heroes halted the construction of the Dakota Access oil pipeline. And it was the time when, for the first time in 100 years, the numbers of tigers in the wild increased. And there are lots of things closer to home to be hopeful about. I'm hopeful when I see that big lemon bus, to be honest, that bus going around the place that is running not on fossil fuels, but either on chip fat, or increasingly they now have some solar panels on their bus garage, and they're now beginning to introduce buses using electricity from renewable energy. And I get excited by Brighton and Hove Energy Services Co-op. This is a group of people who've come together to try to work out how to make insulation in people's homes much cheaper so that people can keep themselves warm in winter. And I'm hopeful when I see people protesting to keep that tree at 7 Dials. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, Tom Druitt, in fact the same guy who runs the big lemon buses, when he's not running the buses he's climbing up the tree to stop it being cut down. So that all around us there are good reasons for feeling hope. And another reason for hope is the growing realisation that the changes that we need to make in order to tackle the climate crisis and to learn to live more sustainably are, I think, positive changes in their own right. So this isn't about hair shirts, it's not about asking you to shiver around a candle in a cave. That's not an attractive prospect, and I will not be able to persuade you. But the case I do want to make is that the things that we need to do to get off the collision course we're on with a climate catastrophe are things that are good in their own right anyway. One of my favourite cartoons, I should have brought it actually, but I didn't have a big enough copy, but one of my favourite cartoons is a professor in a lecture theatre and standing in front of a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard behind her she's listed all of the advantages of moving to a zero carbon economy. In other words, a way of living that doesn't require the fossil fuels that create climate change. So on the whiteboard behind her she's got things like, well, we would have properly insulated homes, we'd have fewer people not being able to afford to keep themselves warm, we'd have local healthy food systems, more people with allotments, for example, we'd have much more affordable public transport, we'd have kids playing in the streets again because there'd be fewer cars, we'd have perhaps more time out of the office. So on this list she's got all these things that are going to happen if we make this shift. And then one of the students in her lecture theatre has her hand up and there's a speech bubble coming out of her mouth saying, but what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason? So when Reverend Michael invited me to join you, he explained that the Village MCC is made up of a relatively small group, but his description painted a picture of an impressively active and community-minded group of volunteers, which is why I was so happy to sneak across the constituency border with Brighton Pavilion and to join you this evening. Because I know I've seen some of the work you've been doing, I've been looking on the website, and I never cease to be impressed by the amazing church communities we have in this city who do so much to support those facing hardship, particularly homeless people, people with difficulty around housing. And so you are just the people who I know are already stewards of the planet and will go on being that. I know you will go on making a better world, planting love, reaping hope, stewards of this, our precious and only home, recognising that we, all of us, are the people that we've been waiting for, and that all of us really can make a difference in the choices and decisions that we make.